The morning Ivy Callahan agreed to marry a man she'd never met, she had in her possession exactly four things: a wool coat with a torn lining she'd been meaning to mend since October, a letter from the Dominion Land Office confirming her late husband's debt had been transferred to her name, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, and a Bible she no longer read, and 37 cents in a tobacco tin her mother had sent from Guelph, along with a note that said simply, "Do what you must." She stood outside the train station in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, on a morning so cold her breath came out in long white plumes, and she thought about that note, "Do what you must." Her mother had written those words before she knew what Ivy was about to do. Before the letter from the land agent in Greystone Flats. Before the arrangement that wasn't quite an arrangement so much as a transaction, a man named Callum Graves. No, not Graves. That was a name she couldn't use. A man named Callum Aldridge, who needed a housekeeper and a woman with some sense, and had apparently decided that a widow who could barely pay her room and board was the practical solution to both. She was 29 years old. She had been a widow for 5 months, and she was about to become a wife again, which was either the bravest thing she had ever done or the most desperate. She hadn't decided which. The wagon that came for her was driven by a boy of maybe 13, red-cheeked and serious in the way boys get when they've been given responsibility too young. He jumped down and took her bag without being asked, which told her something about how he'd been raised. "You the woman from the train?" he said. "I am. You must be, Declan Aldridge." He said it like a declaration. "Pa sent me. Your father couldn't come himself?" Declan's jaw tightened just slightly in the way of someone who'd been asked this question before and didn't enjoy answering it. "Pa doesn't come to town much anymore." She climbed up onto the bench without waiting for help, tucking her coat around her knees. All right then. They rode for an hour and 40 minutes through flat land that became less flat, rolling out toward a sky so enormous. It made Ivy feel like the earth itself was breathing. She'd grown up in Ontario. She knew wide country. But this was something different. This was the kind of land that made a person feel both very small and very exposed at the same time. She learned over those 90 minutes that Declan was the elder of 2. His sister Bea was 8 and lived mostly in her own head, which was his way of saying she was clever and he was proud of her. Their mother had died 3 winters ago. Scarlet fever. Their father had managed the farm since, with help from a hired man named Selby, who Declan described as old and reliable, which seemed to be the highest praise the boy could offer. She did not ask about the father's condition. She'd been told by the land agent, matter-of-factly, that Callum Aldridge had been injured in an accident the previous spring, that the injury had left him with limited use of his right hand, and that this was among the reasons he had written to the agency, looking for a capable woman who understood hard work and had no illusions about what frontier life offered. The agent had written it with the tone of a man listing livestock. Ivy had read it 3 times and then written back yes. She had no illusions, that much was true. The farmhouse came into view as the light was going gold and thin in the west. It was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories, timber and stone, built by someone who'd planned to stay. The outbuildings needed paint. The fence along the east pasture was down in 2 places, but the house itself sat solid on its foundation, and smoke was coming from the chimney, which meant someone had thought to start a fire before dark. Declan pulled the wagon up and jumped down before the horses had fully stopped. He was already untying her bag. A girl appeared in the doorway, small and dark-haired, watching with the focused attention of a child who is cataloging everything for later. "That's Bea," Declan said, unnecessarily. Ivy climbed down and walked toward the door. She crouched to meet the girl's eye level. "Beatrice?" "B." The girl studied her the way you study a sum you haven't quite worked out yet. "Are you going to sleep here?" "I expect so. Papa said you're good at cooking." "I'm passable," Ivy said, which was honest. "Are you hungry?" B considered this seriously. "Always." Ivy stood and went inside. The kitchen was large and functional, and had the particular quality of a room that had been kept clean by someone who didn't care about it, which was different from being kept clean by someone who did. Everything in its place, nothing warm. A pot on the stove that turned out to contain yesterday's beans, kept going in the way things are kept going when no one has the time or inclination to start something new. She had taken off her coat and found the flower before she heard him. The footsteps were uneven, not a limp exactly, more like a gate that had been rebuilt from the ground up after something broke it. She heard him come down the hall and stop in the kitchen doorway, and she finished what she was measuring before she turned around. Callum Aldridge was taller than she'd expected and quieter than the room had been before he entered it. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, dark-eyed and sharp-jawed, with several days of beard he probably hadn't noticed. His right hand, the injured one, was held slightly away from his body, fingers half curled. He'd been using his left more naturally for long enough that the accommodation had become its own habit. He looked at her the way men look at things they're not sure how to categorize. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Mr. Aldridge." He didn't apologize for not meeting the train. She didn't comment on it. They stood there in the kitchen with Bea watching from behind the doorframe and the beans cooling on the stove, and something passed between them that wasn't warmth but wasn't hostility either. Just two practical people assessing what they'd gotten themselves into. "The room's upstairs," he said. "Second on the left, there's a latch." "Thank you. Kids are your business during the day. I'm in the fields or the barn from first light. What happens in this house, that's yours to manage." "All right." He looked at the flour she'd measured. "You don't have to cook tonight. We've got beans." "The beans have been on since yesterday," she said. "I noticed." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. "House is yours," he said again, and left. The ceremony, such as it was, happened 4 days later at the small church in Greystone Flats. The minister was a tired-looking man named Reverend Hogg, who'd married so many practical couples on the frontier that he'd stripped the ceremony down to its essential bones. There were no flowers. There were no guests except for Declan, who stood very straight, and Bea, who spent the entire proceeding examining the window glass for trapped insects. Callum stood beside Ivy at the front of the church and looked at nothing in particular, which she was beginning to understand was his default. Not distance, exactly. More like a man who'd learned to conserve his attention, the way a farmer conserves water in a dry summer, carefully for things that needed it. He placed the ring on her finger with his left hand. It was plain silver and slightly too large, and she felt it settle there with a weight that had nothing to do with metal. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Hogg said. Callum turned and looked at her for 1 full second, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't name yet. Then he pressed his lips briefly to her temple and stepped back, and it was done. They drove home in the wagon in the same silence they'd established in the kitchen. Bea had fallen asleep against Declan's shoulder. The prairie stretched out in every direction under a sky turning the color of a bruise. "I don't expect anything from this," Callum said without looking at her. "Beyond what we discussed, I know I had a wife." He said it simply, not as grief, just as fact. "She was good at this, the house, the children. I'm not asking you to be her. I'm not her," Ivy said. A pause. "No." He glanced at her then, briefly. "You're not." She looked straight ahead at the horses. "My husband was a good man who made bad decisions about money. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand why I'm here. I needed somewhere safe, and I'm willing to work hard for it. That's honest. That's enough," he said. And she believed he meant it. The first month was about learning the house's language. Every house had one. The way the floor creaked in certain spots, the window that stuck, the place where the cold came in under the door no matter how much rags you stuffed against it. Ivy learned Callum's house the way she'd learned to read weather, by paying attention and saying little. She learned Bea before she learned anything else. The girl was quick and fierce, and had the habit of asking questions that adults usually found inconvenient. She'd attach herself to Ivy in the kitchen and narrate her own observations in a steady, low voice, like she was dictating notes. Ivy gave her small tasks and listened. It seemed to be what the girl needed. Declan was harder. He was at the age when boys decide whether to close up or stay open, and he'd been closing for a while. He'd taken on too much too young. She could see it in the careful way he watched his father, always calculating whether to offer help, and always concluding that offering was worse than not. She understood that impulse. She'd grown up around proud men. Callum himself, she circled at a distance. He was up before her every morning. She'd hear him in the kitchen, one-handed and slow, making coffee with a stubbornness that made her chest ache a little. She started getting up earlier, left the coffee already made, the oats on the back of the stove. He never thanked her for it, but the third morning she noticed he'd brought in extra firewood before she'd had to ask, and she understood that was his answer. The hired man, Selby, was exactly as Declan had described, old and reliable, with a face like a geography lesson, and the conversational habits of someone who'd spent 30 years with cattle. He told her on her second week that the Aldridge farm had been one of the best-run operations in the valley 3 years ago. Before the accident, she said. Selby's expression shifted. Before a lot of things. She waited. "Hand's not the whole of it," he said finally, then went back to his work. She kept that in her pocket and kept watching. It was on a Thursday morning in her third week that she found the papers. She was cleaning the small room off the hall that served as Callum's office, or had served as one, before it became the room where things were put when there was no time to deal with them. Stacks of correspondence, land records, supply invoices. She was sorting, not reading, until a name caught her eye. Percival Wren. It appeared 3 times in 5 minutes of sorting. On a letter from a grain merchant. On an invoice for equipment. on a contract from the previous spring that outlined the terms of a cooperative arrangement between the Aldridge Farm and Wren Agricultural Services. She sat down on the floor with the papers spread around her and started reading more carefully. The invoices didn't add up. Not in the way that bad luck doesn't add up, where the numbers are low and the explanations are clear. These didn't add up in the way that manipulation doesn't add up, where the numbers are high and the explanations are elaborate, and when you look closely, every cost increase or canceled order or failed delivery traces back to the same source. Percival Wren. She found him mentioned in Callum's ledgers too, though not by name, per PW recommendation, arranged by PW Services, PW handling negotiations, over and over in the months after the accident whenever something had gone wrong. Ivy sat with those papers for a long time. She thought about Selby's face when she'd mentioned the accident. She thought about the down fence and the thin cattle and the way Callum moved through the farm with a kind of controlled grief, like a man watching something he built sink slowly underwater and not being able to stop it. She thought about Percival Wren. She put the papers back exactly as she'd found them, but she kept the shape of it in her head. That evening at supper, she mentioned Wren's name the way you test ice, carefully from a distance, watching for the give. Callum's fork stopped moving, just for a second. Where'd you hear that name? Someone's in town mentioned him, said he does agricultural consulting. Callum set down his fork. He does. You work with him? Used to. His voice was flat. He offered to take over the business side of things after the accident, when I couldn't manage the correspondence myself. He looked at his hand, briefly, then away. Seemed sensible at the time, and things started going wrong after that. A long silence. Declan and Bea had both gone still in the particular way of children who know when adult conversation has weight. Kids, Callum said quietly, go check on the horses. They went without argument. He waited until the door closed. What did you find? She told him plainly, without drama. The invoices, the letters, the pattern she'd seen in the ledgers. She didn't soften it. She'd found that soft delivery sometimes made things easier to dismiss. He listened with his hands flat on the table, and she watched his face do something complicated. Not surprise. She didn't think it was surprise. More like a man hearing out loud a thing he'd been afraid to think. I thought it was me, he said finally, after the hand. I thought I was the one failing, that I couldn't manage things right anymore, that everything falling apart was because He stopped. Someone's been making sure it falls apart, Ivy said. There's a difference. He looked at her directly. It was the longest he'd looked at her since she'd arrived. Why are you showing me this? Because you need to know. Most people wouldn't involve themselves. You've been here 3 weeks. I'm your wife, she said. Whether it started practical or not, it started. That makes this my concern too. Something shifted in his face. Not gratitude exactly. More like the expression of someone who's been expecting to be abandoned and has just realized cautiously that maybe this time they won't be. All right, he said. What do you think we should do? Percival Wren appeared at the farm 2 days later. He rode in on a good horse, well dressed for the territory, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed. He was maybe 40, broad-shouldered, with a salesman's face. Everything symmetrical, nothing quite settling. He greeted Callum with the familiarity of long acquaintance and looked at Ivy the way men look at something unexpected in a room they thought they knew. Mrs. Aldridge, he said smoothly. I hadn't heard Callum had remarried. Congratulations. Thank you. She kept her voice pleasant. Wren turned his attention back to Callum. I've come about the grain contract. The Lethbridge buyer is reconsidering, I'm afraid. Market concerns, he says. I wanted to discuss your options before he makes a final decision. What options? Callum said. Wren spread his hands, the gesture of a man who's made it his business to appear helpful. A sale might be wise. Land values are holding. If the farm continues on its current trajectory, the farm is fine, Ivy said. Wren's eyes moved to her with the particular expression of a man who has decided not to acknowledge an interruption. These decisions are complicated, Mrs. Aldridge. The debt position alone. Which debts? She said. The supply invoices that doubled without explanation or the equipment repairs billed at twice the market rate? A silence. Small, careful, like glass cracking from the inside. I handle the accounts for several operations in the valley, Wren said. His voice had acquired a precision it hadn't had before. Costs fluctuate in the same direction at the same rate, all traced back to your recommendations. She looked at him steadily. That's not fluctuation. That's a pattern. Wren looked at Callum, man to man, the way certain men revert to when a conversation has stopped going their way. I think your wife has some misunderstandings about how commercial agriculture operates. My wife, Callum said, was keeping books before she was 16. She understands numbers fine. Wren's pleasantness faded. What was underneath was quieter and colder. You should think carefully, Callum. You're in no position to make enemies. I'm in no position to keep being robbed either. Callum held his gaze. Get off my land. Wren left. They stood and watched him ride out, and Ivy felt the particular cold of knowing that wasn't the end of anything, just the beginning of something harder. She was right. The following week, Selby found the east pasture gate open, and 6 head of Aldridge cattle gone. Not wandered, the gate had been lifted off its pins deliberately, something that didn't happen by accident. 2 days after that, a letter arrived from the Lethbridge buyer confirming that yes, he was canceling the grain contract. He had concerns, he wrote, about the management of the Aldridge operation. A colleague had expressed reservations. They both knew the name of the colleague. He's going to keep at it, Ivy said that night, after the children were in bed. She'd spread the ledgers out on the kitchen table and was cross-referencing dates with the correspondence, building a timeline with the patients she'd learned, keeping books for her late husband's freight business, back when there was still a business to keep. Until there's nothing left to take, or until we stop him. How do we stop him? Callum said. He was sitting across from her, right hand resting on the table. She'd noticed he did that sometimes in the evenings. Let the hand just rest, instead of holding it away from things. She thought it might be a kind of deliberate practice, letting himself be seen in the state he was in. We need to know who else he's done this to, she said. He runs accounts for how many farms? 7, 8, maybe more. Then some of them have noticed the same patterns. They just haven't said anything because they thought they were the only ones. Callum was quiet for a moment. You think we could find them? I think if one person speaks up, it's a complaint. If 5 do, it's evidence. She looked at him over the ledger. Do you know those farmers well enough to write to them? Some. Right. They worked on the letters together over 3 evenings, Callum dictating while Ivy wrote with her faster and cleaner hand, keeping the language careful and factual, asking questions rather than making accusations, leaving room for the other men to share what they'd seen. Callum sealed each one himself, pressing the wax with the heel of his left hand. I was going to sell, he said on the 3rd evening without preamble. Ivy looked up. Before you got here, I was already looking at the numbers and thinking there was no way out. That maybe Wren was right and selling was the only thing left. He looked at the stack of letters. I was so tired of fighting something I couldn't see. You can see it now, because of you. She shook her head. The pattern was there. You just needed someone who had distance from it, someone who could see it without feeling like they'd failed. He looked at his hand. I did fail. Trusted the wrong person. Trusting family doesn't make you stupid, she said. It makes you human. He looked up sharply. Wren's not family. No, but you worked with him for years. You trusted him because you'd always trusted him. That's not a failure of judgment. That's a reasonable expectation that turned out to be wrong. She paused. He's the one who failed, not you. Callum said nothing for a long moment. Then, you're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who'd keep the stove going and stay out of the way. I do keep the stove going, she said. Something crossed his face that might, in better light, have been called a smile. The first response to their letters came from a farmer named Bertram Souls, 40 kilometers north, who wrote back within the week in a hand so emphatic the pen had nearly gone through the paper. Yes, he'd seen the same thing. Yes, he had documents. Yes, he'd been afraid to say anything, because Wren had contacts with the land office and he didn't want trouble. But if Callum was willing to take it further, so was he. 3 more letters arrived the following week. One from a widow running a cattle operation south of town. One from a man who'd already sold and was furious about it, now that he understood why things had gone so wrong. One from a grain cooperative that had noticed their numbers didn't square with what the individual farms were reporting. 5 of us, Callum said, laying the letters on the table. Enough to go to the mounted police, Ivy said. Enough to make it more than one man's word. They went to the NWMP detachment in Maple Creek on a Wednesday morning, arriving before Ivy had fully decided what she was going to say. But she knew the numbers. She'd memorized the timeline, and she'd learned, in her years keeping her late husband's accounts, that numbers didn't require eloquence. They just required someone willing to present them clearly and stand behind them. Sergeant Fitch was a spare, deliberate man who listened the way a good doctor listens, without interrupting, without suggesting, just gathering. He went through the documents slowly. He asked questions that told her he understood more about commercial fraud than his title might suggest. When she'd finished laying it out, he sat back and looked at both of them. You understand, he said, that Mr. Wren has associates in this district who will make this difficult. We understand, Callum said, and you're willing to proceed. We're willing to proceed, Ivy said. Fitch looked at her, then at Callum, then back at her. All right, he said, let's begin. What followed was slow and uncomfortable in the way that justice usually is when it goes up against money and connections. Wren had allies. He had a solicitor from Regina, who made the initial inquiry sound like harassment. He had the Lethbridge buyer on his side, who maintained that his concerns about the Aldridge operation had been legitimate and freely formed. He had a version of events that was coherent and confident, which was more than many men in his position could say. But he didn't have the numbers. And he didn't have 5 farmers with corroborating documents, who were each suddenly far less afraid now that they could see each other. Ivy spent 3 days in Maple Creek giving a formal statement, laying out the ledger evidence in the kind of methodical detail that made the NWMP constable's pen struggle to keep up. She cross-referenced supply invoices with market rates. She showed the exact dates when costs began rising and traced each increase to a Wren recommendation. She explained twice how the grain contract cancellations had been engineered, a word she used deliberately and then stood behind when the solicitor objected. Callum gave his own account separately. He was less fluent than she was, but he was specific, and he was certain, and he had the quality that credible witnesses always have, the quality of a man who is not telling a story but is simply reporting what happened. The widow from south of town, a woman named Marin Scoose, gave the most damning testimony. She had records going back 4 years. She'd kept every invoice and every letter, not because she suspected anything, but because she was thorough. Those records showed, as clearly as anything could show it, a systematic inflation of costs tied directly to Wren's involvement. They brought Wren in for questioning on a Thursday evening. Ivy and Callum were not there for it, but Sergeant Fitch sent word the following morning that Wren had, under the weight of the accumulated evidence, declined to provide a satisfactory explanation for any of it. Charges were laid the following week: fraud, theft by manipulation, breach of fiduciary duty. The list was long and specific and had been drafted by someone who intended it to hold. They drove home that afternoon through the same flat then rolling land she'd arrived in 3 months earlier, and Ivy watched the grass move in the wind and thought about the word home, which she hadn't used without hesitation in 5 months. It'll take time, Callum said. The trial. Getting back what was lost. Yes. The farm won't be what it was overnight. No. She looked at the horizon. But it'll keep being a farm. That's what matters. He was quiet for a moment. I need to tell you something about the hand. She turned. Doctor in Maple Creek, the one who saw me after the accident. He said the nerve damage is permanent. Said I'd never get full function back. He sent it to the road ahead. Not to her, which she understood. Some things are easier to say when you're not being watched. I've known for a year. I just didn't. I kept thinking if I worked hard enough at it, you'd get it back. She thought about what she knew of nerve damage, which was not much, but was something. The woman she'd helped care for in her 2nd year of marriage, a neighbor who'd broken her wrist badly in a fall and spent a winter relearning what her hand could and couldn't do. The exercises the doctor had prescribed. The slow, dull work of it. The way the woman had said the following spring that the hand would never be what it was, but it was more than she'd thought it would be. There are things that can help, she said carefully. Not fix, but help. Exercises, specific movements. I've seen it work, not completely, but enough to matter. She paused. If you're willing to try. Callum's jaw worked. She'd learned to read that particular movement. It meant he was weighing pride against sense. You'd have to touch it, he said. Yes, I don't. It's not a pleasant thing to look at. The scarring, I've seen scars, she said. A long silence. The wagon wheels turned over the dry ground. All right, he said finally. We can try. That became the new ritual of their evenings. After supper, after the children were settled, Callum would sit at the kitchen table and extend his right hand, and Ivy would work through the exercises she remembered, careful and methodical, pressing and releasing, moving each finger through its limited range of motion. She learned what he could tolerate and what was too much. She learned the geography of that damage the way she'd learned the house. By paying attention and saying little, he bore it without complaint. The first 3 evenings he barely spoke, but gradually, in the way that shared routines make space for shared speech, the silence became something more like conversation. Bay drew a picture of you today, he said one evening. What kind of picture? Put you in it next to the house. Drew herself next to you. A pause. She hasn't put herself in pictures with people for a while. Ivy kept her hands moving. She's a good girl. Curious. She's like her mother that way. He said it without particular pain, just as a fact. Margaret was always asking questions. Drove me mad sometimes. His voice was level. I miss it now. How long were you married? 11 years. He flexed his fingers slightly under her hands. She was a good woman. We were good together. I'm sorry. Yeah, he looked at the table. Are you? Sorry. For your husband, she considered. I'm sorry he died. I'm sorry he made choices that left me without anything. Those are 2 different kinds of sorry. She paused. It was not the same as what you're describing. He wasn't unkind. But I was more alone in that marriage than I should have been. Callum said nothing. This is stranger, she said. What we're doing. starting from a letter and a transaction and building something from there. But I'm less alone in it than I expected to be. That's on it, he looked at her. So am I, he said. Less alone than I expected. She let that sit. Then, try to close your fingers slowly, all the way if you can. He tried. The movement was halting, incomplete, but more than the first evening. She noted it without saying so. Some progress was better not announced too early. You had to see it, hold before you named it. Declan came to her on a Saturday morning, hands shoved in his pockets with the expression of someone who has been working up to a conversation for several days. She was hanging laundry, and she didn't stop, because she'd found that people talked more easily when you weren't watching them. Is it going to be okay? He said. The farm. Yes, she said. It's going to be okay. Pa was really worried. For a long time, I know. He doesn't. Declan stopped. Started again. He doesn't show it, but I can tell. When he's worried, he gets really quiet, quieter than usual. I've noticed that too, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You're good at noticing things. I pay attention. She clipped another sheet to the line. So do you? You noticed your father needed help before you were old enough to give it. That's not easy to carry. Declan's throat moved. I just didn't want the farm to go. It's all we've got left of Mama, sort of. She planted those trees along the fence. She painted the kitchen. If we had to sell, you're not selling. She turned and looked at him directly. The farm is yours, all of it, and I'm going to help your father hold on to it. He studied her with those careful young eyes. Why? She thought about it, honestly. Because someone should have helped me when I needed it and didn't. And because your father is a good man who trusted the wrong person, and that shouldn't cost him everything. She paused. And because I live here now, this is mine too. I don't walk away from things that are mine. Something shifted in Declan's face. Slowly, in the careful way of someone who's been deliberately not hoping, he let himself look like a boy instead of a small adult. Okay, he said quietly. Good. The trial was held in Maple Creek in early autumn, 6 months after Ivy had arrived in Saskatchewan, with 37 cents and a torn coat lining. She sat in the courthouse with Callum on one side and Marin Scoos on the other, and she listened to Sergeant Fitch lay out the case with the precise, unhurried competence of a man who'd done this work for a long time and took it seriously. Wren had a good solicitor, and the solicitor did his best with what he had. He questioned the accuracy of the ledgers. He suggested that commercial costs fluctuate for reasons unrelated to mismanagement. He implied carefully that a woman who'd arrived in the district 3 months ago was perhaps not the most reliable interpreter of long-standing business relationships. When it was Ivy's turn, she sat in the witness chair with her hands folded and answered every question in the same even tone she used for everything, and she did not rise to any of it. Numbers were numbers. Dates were dates. She had the documents and she had the timeline, and she had memorized them so completely that the solicitor finally sat down with the expression of a man who has tried to change the subject with someone who does not change subjects. Marin Scoose was on the stand for an hour and a half. When she finally stepped down, 2 jury members were making notes. It took the jury less than a day. When the foreman read the verdict, guilty on all principal counts, Ivy sat very still and let herself feel it. The release of something she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She'd been holding it since the day she sorted those papers on the office floor, maybe longer. Maybe since the lawyer arrived at her door 5 months ago with Thomas's debt transfer and a polite expression. Maybe longer than that. Callum's left hand found hers on the bench. He held it without looking at her, because some things were better handled without ceremony. She held it back. They walked out into autumn light, the kind of thin, sharp gold that Saskatchewan does better than anywhere she'd ever been. And Marin Scoose shook their hands and said what everyone was thinking, which was that she'd been afraid for a long time and was glad it was done. The other farmers found them in the crowd outside. There was the quiet, particular satisfaction of people who had stood together through something and come out the other side. On the way home, Bea fell asleep across both of them, her head on Ivy's lap and her feet against Callum's leg. Declan drove the wagon with the focused attention he gave everything, and the sun went down in long red streaks over the flat country. She snores, Callum said. I know. I can hear her through the floor. A pause. Does it bother you? No. Ivy looked down at the child's face, slack and trusting in sleep. No, it doesn't bother me at all. Callum looked at her the way he'd started looking at her in the evenings when the careful distance had begun, slowly, to be something else. Not a transaction, not a practical arrangement. Something that had grown in the way useful things grow without announcement from the ground up. I didn't think this would be what it is, he said. Neither did I. It's more. Yes, she looked at him. It is. He nodded once the way he affirmed things. Then he looked back at the road, and she looked back at Bea. And Declan drove them home in the last of the light, past the fence that was mended now, and the gate that no longer hung loose, past the trees Margaret had planted along the east border that were turning gold in the October air. The farm was smaller than it had been 3 years ago, before the grief and the accident and the slow ruin Wren had engineered. It would take another season, maybe two, to be what Callum had built it to be. There would be hard winters. There would be hard decisions. The hand would never fully come back, and some of what had been lost in those 3 years would stay lost. But the farm was theirs. Every fence post, every grain row, every acre of it. And that night, after Bea had been carried inside and Declan had put the horses up and the kitchen was quiet and warm, Callum sat at the table and extended his right hand across the table to her. She took it in both of hers and began.